Lewis Roberts, who is the Vice Chair of the British Association of Social Workers. Lewis.
Yes, good morning. As you say, I'm Lewis Roberts. I'm a children and family social worker working in the northeast of England, but I'm also the Vice Chair of the British Association of Social Work, or BASW. Just for some background, BASW is the professional association for social work and social workers, and it's the largest membership association for social workers and the only independent body for social work in the UK. We're taking a lead on expressing publicly what we think social work is and what we think it can be in the future. And that's why I'm so delighted to be here this morning to think more about social work's role post-pandemic with the recovery, and also the next steps to ensure that the needs of children and families are met within our society. So today I'm going to very briefly talk about some of the findings from our survey, which we published earlier this year. Over 1,000 social work members contributed and shared their experiences of practicing social work during COVID-19. I'm also going to briefly discuss BASW's vision for children and family social work, which is very relevant to today's discussions. And then finally, I hope to have some time to reflect on my own social work practice as a children and family social worker working in a deprived inner city locality, which may be of interest to some delegates. Social work with children and families is well known to be high pressure and challenging role. We know that prior to the pandemic, working conditions for social workers were not always good enough, that caseloads often too high and support and supervision variable. Social workers have worked selflessly and tirelessly over the past 14 months to keep services going and to support children and families within our communities. The profession should be applauded for this, and I'd personally like to thank all the social workers out there for their endless dedication to public service. We know that many children and families, life during the pandemic has got harder, and the more families have been plunged into deep poverty, that food bank use has exploded, and that more children and families are living in destitution. BASW have heard from social workers that they're having to provide a lot more practical support to children and families to ensure that the very basic needs are being met. For example, in the area where I practice, over 17,000 children have accessed food banks in the second half of 2020. BASW's survey informs that many of the workplace challenges social workers experienced pre-pandemic have remained. Indeed, for many social workers, practice has become more challenging during this period. 58% of social work respondents to our survey agreed that working during the pandemic has negatively impacted on their mental health. 71% agree that the pandemic has negatively impacted on workplace morale, and 68% of respondents agreed that working from home has made it a lot more difficult for practitioners to switch off. For many frontline social workers, they struggled with working with trauma, and it's going to take the workforce time to recover. Social workers have told BASW that they've encountered more difficulties in accessing essential services for children and families. 70% of survey respondents agreed that they've encountered more difficulties in communicating with children and families because of the digital exclusion that they may face. For children and family social workers, virtual social work and remote working has been a real challenge. Social workers have adapted and demonstrated amazing resilience, but we must not lose sight that social work is a human vocation and that building and developing human relationships should be central to everything that we do. Virtual court hearings, virtual family time or family contact have served a short-term purpose, but we must not advocate for this as a longer-term solution. Some aspects of life, quite simply, require face-to-face interactions. BASW understands clearly that an increased use of technology is here to stay and that flexible and agile approaches to working can benefit some. We've heard from members describing innovations and that some social workers have been able to maintain more informal contact with children and families. They've been able to undertake regular phone and video check-ins and reframe their role perhaps more towards more help and support. However, we must be clear that social workers often work with and alongside marginalised communities, and that digital technology is not always available and equitable. Social workers inform that they're not always provided with fit-for-purpose technology and that connectivity can remain a challenge when working remotely. We know that undertaking sensitive work with children and families is not always appropriate over video calls, and social workers need time and space to reflect and to decompress. Social workers continue to need manageable workloads, access high-quality supervision, and services that are funded that meet the needs of the communities in which we work. BASW's vision for children and family social work outlines 12 actions to change. I don't have time to discuss them all here today, but I'd really encourage delegates to access that vision on the BASW website. But the actions that I would pick out as being most pertinent to the post-pandemic recovery is to highlight the importance of developing family support services that are located within communities, that children and families have their basic needs met, and that we know that they're not always being met at the moment, and that we prevent children coming into statutory services, and prevent escalation. We must get better at listening to those within our communities who have suffered most during this pandemic, often people with the fewest resources. Those with lived experience of social work services must be front and centre as we learn, recover and reform services. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to taking any questions in due course.
Thank you so much, Lewis. Thank